So I will start by welcoming you, Cathy,
Thank you.
and ask you to begin by discussing the ways in which academic research can be really settler minded, what it means to take a decolonizing approach to research.
Okay, sure. Yeah, I will. I mean, it's a big question, so I'll just ask. I mean, I'll talk a little bit about, just a few things that are historical and ongoing and terms of, some the ways research has been tended to be done, and then some ideas for, yeah, what it means to decolonize. And I'm use quotes because I just think the word gets used a lot, so I can just talk a little bit about what that means. But I think, in general, academic research has often been very focused on the needs and wants. Oh, oh, sorry, something just popped up. Sorry, I just got distracted. The whiteboard came up. Yeah, so it has focused on the needs and wants and benefit of Western research institutions such as universities, and also, and academics, like benefiting the university or the academic career, rather than focusing on, what the actual Indigenous community or the Indigenous peoples that they're working with need. So oftentimes that has included, where the projects are pretty much, developed and designed, and then the researcher goes to the community and says, "Hey, I want to do this research. Do you want to work? Do you want to work with us?" Or they just kind of, yeah, just kind of slip in through back doors. So I think that's one way that research has been very settler minded. I mean, I think it also includes that, there's a lot of university policies, such as around timelines, who holds the funding, et cetera, that don't facilitate communities leading and identifying research. So that's another, I think, way that research has been. Yeah, it's just, and it's, I mean, I think it still is that way. That is going to be, that's a tougher battle, I think, to change. And it's, it's slow because the research institutions are big, and, they've been operating in a particular way for a long time. So, it's not going to change easily. But I think that, yeah, in terms of like policies, timelines, some of those things really enable that kind of research, the kind of research that is more geared towards benefiting the university and the researcher. So, because it takes time to do good Indigenous research, to do it in a good way, it takes time, and it takes time to build, meaningful community relationships, and those, should start before you even like I mean, there is a big shift towards community or Indigenous community or Indigenous organization identified research. So meaning that they're deciding what the research is, and then you come in as the academic researcher, and that it's more of, it's a partnership, more of an equal partnership. Yeah, and I think that also there has been a tendency to, what some researchers call, that are critical of this, of a, Western colonial way of doing research, call helicopter research too, where academic researchers kind of fly in, do the research, and then they leave, and then the community never hears from them again. Or, yeah, there's no kind of transparency about any knowledge sharing or any discussion. And there's still instances of that. There was a recent case at Dalhousie University, actually, where, yeah, there was some things that were done where a community found out about some of the results of the research at a conference they just happened to attend. And so, so there are, even though things are shifting and there's more awareness, it is that kind, way of doing things is still there. But I think there is much more awareness now about, the need to have community engaged, at least research, or community identified, and that relationship doesn't just end, it starts before the research and it continues after the research. So, and that includes, yeah, negotiating, how are we going to share this work? Who has the rights over, the knowledge that's been gathered? And some of that is around, we've heard of, I think most of us have heard of OCAP principles, the principles of ownership, control, access, and possession, around data sovereignty. So, things like that need to be negotiated, right? And so I think there is definitely more of a growing awareness about that. I mean, what else can I say about that? I think, yeah, I've talked about restrictive timelines, just, but I think it is also, you know, a very sometimes subtle way, but sometimes not so subtle way that, we value certain types of research and certain types of knowledges, certain types of approaches to research over others. And so, it means kind of challenging the naturalization of Western knowledges and approaches as being considered more valuable and legitimate. And, understanding that really, Indigenous peoples and communities have been doing research since time immemorial. That's how they have survived. And, it's just, but I think the way, the parameters around what is considered research too also can shift. I don't know if there's anything else that you wanted to follow up on that question, if I've responded in a way that is clear and, helpful to, because I think it is true that there is still research being done that is not being done in a good way, right? So, but it is definitely changing, and and that is partly because many Indigenous communities and organizations that have the capacity are doing their own research, and also are not not have an open door. Like you have to follow these kinds of protocols, or it's just not. They're not going to. Yeah, it's not going to happen, right? So, yeah.
So again, on kind of setting the background for
Mm-hmm.
the project, if you can talk about University of Toronto's Kana Indigenous funding stream
Sure.
and the infrastructure that you and others at the university have built that supported the initiative that we're going to talk
about. Okay, sure. Yeah, so this funding stream was the Canadian Indigenous stream it was part of 3 Indigenous strategic initiatives at the University of Toronto, which I was part of. I know I'm no longer part of there. I'm not involved in that anymore, but it started in 2020. That's when my involvement began. And that's when the Canadian Indigenous stream started in 2020. That was its inaugural round. And so there was 3 initiatives. One was revising their Indigenous ethics review and protocol, creating an Indigenous research network, and this Indigenous funding stream that was really created through and based on the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, but also through the Office of the Vice President of Research and Innovation. They appointed an Indigenous academic advisor for Indigenous research. They hired, from my position, I was at first a special projects officer, and then I was the postdoctoral fellow that evaluated the program. So that was part of, how it created, but it came out of, the university's strategic plan around, to contribute to reconciliation and to try and do things differently, and, answering the calls to action from the TRC. And so it was supported. And so the Kanad Indigenous stream is an internal funding program at U of T. And so they have many different streams. I don't know all of them, but this was a new stream that was meant to, the goals were to, build community relationships, healthy relationships, to ensure that the research was Indigenous community or organization identified first, that they were the lead of the research, and the academic researcher was to take more of a backseat as a mentor or a guide as needed. And it was also meant to be, the process was different and purposefully different. It was not based so much on a competitive funding model where, only the researchers or applications with applicants that had, the most publications or, these stellar backgrounds were considered. I mean, there's just so many things that come into it, because this project, it started in January 2020, and then the pandemic hit. So everything just shifted and changed, altered from what it was meant to be. So I think and I'm making that point, which answers a question you ask later, is that, we only heard from about 20 people responded to our cold calls, which, as noted, we reached out to about 700 communities and organizations across Canada. So we had a very slow response rate. And then out of those, we had 11 communities and organizations that were interested. So, the like kind of collaborative, non-competitive side of things was in that sense easier because we weren't inundated with people that were interested or communities that were interested, because it was meant to be, and the process was really, that if the community agreed, had a research project, then we helped them find an academic researcher, and if that relationship worked, and as long as they created a proposal that was viable, we worked with them to create a proposal that was strong and would be funded. So it was kind of understood that once you got to the proposal stage, you were going to be funded. You just had to make sure, and so it was more of a kind of back and forth of, they co-wrote the proposal, we provided feedback, and then it was submitted. Then the Connaught review team also provided feedback, and then we worked with the teams as needed if they needed to revise their proposal. So yeah, it was meant to be this collaborative, kind of non-competitive approach to getting funding. So that's partly what we're calling, that was part of the decolonizing framework that we were using, that, and yeah, that just to and really to hold, I think that the role that we had as the Indigenous kind of research circle was really about helping to make sure that those relationships were good, and any problems that arose. But I'll try not to get ahead of myself. I think I'm going to talk about that a bit later. But yeah, it's just that it was part of these strategic initiatives related to the Truth and Reconciliation calls to action, and it was created through the Office of the Vice President, Research and Innovation. And then we also had, as I said, an academic provostial advisor for Indigenous research. We had me, special projects officer. We had Indigenous and non-Indigenous research assistants working with us. And we also had a traditional knowledge holder that was part of that, a core part of that circle, and was involved right from the beginning and throughout. So he was part of all of meetings that we held with the communities, with the academic researchers, and if any problems arose. And also, we had an Indigenous Elders Council that we also worked with, not quite as closely, because we had that we would meet more, every few months with them. But with the knowledge holder, he was part of all of the meetings, which were very, regular, particularly in the beginning. So he kind of helped us ground things in, traditional Indigenous knowledges and ceremony, and help keep things grounded. And yeah, he was a very big part of the process. So that was all of that was part of the infrastructure. I think the university, what one of their goals was too, besides answering the calls to action, was to help build more, to build community engagement, to build more Indigenous community relationships that were, just a little bit different, that it was, they were more in charge. But it was, that was part of the goal or objective as well, was for the university to facilitate the researchers building, more community relationships. So
dig into that aspect. One of the things that you touched on, but I think it's worth really highlighting, is that it was the community bodies that were really responsible for doing research. And there was not a PI on the academic side, but instead the role of the academic partner was as a research mentor. That's interesting for both groups, because it's asking each to take a role that is probably not customary or necessary, or something that they really know how to do necessarily at the start. So I'm hoping you can talk a little bit about the experiences of the teams on these 11 projects, and what it looked like both for the community organizations and the researchers.
Okay.
Defining and then holding these roles that are not the norm.
Right. Yeah, no, and there were definitely some challenges that came up. I'll just talk a little bit just about our process. So, because I think it's important. So, initially, as I mentioned, we reached out just through a cold email, through a cold call. We had we did have some connections to communities organizations, but, after that, the communities or organizations that were interested, we met with them first. So our Indigenous Research Circle met with them, and in all of the cases, we met more than once. And that was to help them, because there was varying capacities. There was one community organization that had a lot of experience doing research. They had a research associate, so they were very, comfortable doing research. There was others that had never done research but really wanted to venture into that. And that was actually another objective of this project, was to help build, if needed and wanted, was to help build research capacity at the Indigenous community, in the Indigenous community, and at the organization. So that included funding, any research assistance were to come from the organization or the community unless otherwise negotiated. But yeah, we met with them a number of times before we reached out to find, potential academic researchers that would be a match for them. So that was important and foundational to the process too, so that we had established, some trust. And that took a while, because it was online and everybody was, it was a crazy time, as we all remember well, that, and so there was competing priorities, etc. But yeah, building that trust and relationship was really the focus at first. And then we introduced what we did was based on what the community wanted, the type of research, the subject of the research that they wanted to do, which in some instances, again, we helped them kind of flesh out. Others, they had their research question, they were good to go. But then we reached out first through a more university-wide call, and then we did more targeted calls, say, hey, we have a community, an Indigenous community, and they're interested in doing this research. They're looking for a researcher with expertise in these areas. And so that worked for a few of them. And then we kind of, specifically, we did some research in different departments based on what the subject of the research was, to find potential academic researchers who might be interested. And, there was a lot of interest, but then there was also people who was like, oh, I'm not too sure about this. Because I think, because it was kind of, for most of the people that became involved on the academic research side, it was a new way of doing things for them. And we definitely heard from the academic researchers side that, that they loved it, they learned a lot, but, we also heard, this was challenging. I was trained to be a principal investigator, and trying to find that balance between staying more in the backseat, but also staying engaged was challenging for a few people that we heard from, academic researchers that we heard from. And, and then from the Indigenous community side of things, there were, again, as I said, there was varying capacities around research. And so some were really not comfortable being in the driver's seat and they wanted more guidance. And so that was really, something, again, that was negotiated throughout, and we helped with that. But there was varying levels, I guess, of a couple of projects the academic researcher, they didn't really do, they were involved, but they were really in the background. Others were more kind of, partners, more equal partners, because they were providing more guidance and mentorship as needed for that particular community. So yeah, so I think that, there were some challenges in that way because of that training. And also, I think, we also heard, and that is talked about a bit in the paper that, we're referring to here, is that, there's still, even though one of the goals of the funding program was to help balance out, make a more equal partnership, the university and the academic researchers still held the control over the actual funding. They also held control, they were the ones, it was a joint application, but in terms of ethics, the academic researcher for the academic institution research ethics side anyways was, they were the point of contact. The community was kind of outside of that in that way. But particularly the funding aspect of things, that the community didn't have any control. They had to invoice to pay their research assistants, and the universities take a long time sometimes to pay people. So that really was something we heard loud and clear, that for the academic researchers and for the community, it was a problem. Because if as an academic researcher, you really want to, kind of shift outside of that PI system and have more power balance, then there needs to be at least equal control over the funds, right? So that's something that, I think is one of the things that requires some work to shift at the university. I mean, I was involved in another project actually at Dalhousie where they did, I was part of the Wabanaki Labrador Indigenous Health Research Network there, and they actually did negotiate for the communities to hold funding themselves. But that took time, and it's a smaller university, so sometimes smaller universities, things are easier to shift. So I'm not sure where things are standing with that now, because as I said, I'm not involved anymore. But that was definitely something we heard very clearly, that if you want to have a collaborative partnership, then there needs to be a more equal power relationship. What else? So I'm not sure, maybe if you wanted to just, have I answered the question? Or did you?
Absolutely.
Okay.
It was
There's
a nice
so much to say. There's so much to say.
So I want to get into one aspect of that I found really fascinating, because I do a lot of community engaged research. And so your team that had already built the trust and the relationship with the communities served as, in your words, sort of a mediating role in these introductions between the communities and potential academic researchers. And importantly, in this decolonizing framework, communities could say no to academic researchers. And so I'm really curious, in that process of beginning those initial discussions of, is a partnership workable on both sides? What are your insights from that process and self-reflections about that process of the early relationship building, and how having your role as a mediator change the dynamics of that relative to the more standard ways that community engaged research start?
Well, I think like a very quick answer is there was like I think a little more accountability present because of our role in that, but it's more than that. And I think we were also, we were maybe we were a mediator, but we also were support. We were also like help build relationships. We were there to problem solve, but we really prioritized the relationship with the community or the organization. And so really making sure that we were checked in with them, like how are things going? And there were a few instances where there was one instance where this organization community, actually, they had a research idea. We introduced them to a researcher that they had a couple of meetings together, but then the community decided that they didn't have the capacity at that time to do the research. And I think also the academic researcher they were keen, but I think they realized that it was going to be, like their role with this community was going to be very much more involved in a way, because they hadn't done research before. But they wanted to continue, but the community made the decision that it just wasn't the right time. Partly that was because of COVID, and partly it was, I just think they're like, well, they weren't too sure about research anyways, like how it was going to be a benefit to them, especially during a pandemic when the topic was, not related. I mean, it was about land rights and landing, encroachment from cottagers in a region in Ontario, but on a reserve. But so I think that's one thing. So prioritizing the relationship with the community and organization, helping them negotiate if there were, if someone changed their mind. And another instance, actually, a researcher decided that they weren't a good fit because I think it was because of it was like a question that they wanted to ask. She was a sociologist, and the question that they really wanted to answer wasn't, as it turned out, as things got flushed out, it really wasn't a sociological study. So we helped them find another person that, yeah. And I think that just like, yeah, it didn't mesh, right? So then we helped find another person and it worked out really well. And so, yeah, I think we were a mediator, we were support, we were a guide, and most of the researchers, I think partly why they were interested in being involved because they they wanted to do research related and with Indigenous communities, but they had never done it. That was a lot of the cases. There was a couple of Indigenous researchers that had done a lot of Indigenous research that were also involved. But yeah, for the most part, they wanted to build, to learn about how to do this research in a good way and how to learn from the community. And yeah, they were very open and wanting to let the community run, like organize, like lead things with their guidance. So I think that, I mean, part of my insights about those core discussions was really, and actually before I go on to that, another key part was, the fact that we had a traditional knowledge holder at every meeting with the community and the researcher was really key, because it wasn't like there was any major problems that arose during the meetings, or say there was some conversations that kind of happened on the side afterwards, but having access to him was really important because yeah, he was able just to keep things grounded in, we always did a traditional opening at all of our meetings, and so it sent this kind of tone and of the meeting itself, and so it was very respectful, and it kind of set the tone of our conversations and how those went. So he was a very key part of things, and also having, we had a couple of Indigenous youth that are, they weren't from the communities that we were working with in those partnerships, but they, were part of the community in Toronto. And so, yeah, having some youth there too was also really helpful. So it was like, and I mean, I myself, I have, having some experience doing and did like working with communities, community engagement, and doing Indigenous research and being part of the urban Indigenous community in Toronto myself too. Like, I think that, just the whole team was, yeah, we worked well together, and all of our roles were important. But I do think that having, access to elders and having the traditional knowledge holder there was really important. And yeah, something that I think would be a suggestion, particularly, yeah, wanting to do, or for when questions arise or when problems arise and things like that. Like, how do you negotiate those in a good, safe way so that everybody feels, comfortable. So let's see. I think that one of the question is, do you think a mediator role should become a core aspect of new relationship building in similar circumstances? I think that's part of the question as well. I mean, I'm not sure about having a mediator, but I think that having resources or guidance is critical. Like having, yeah. And one of the things that was actually suggested that was, kind of something that we could evolve more in that, or in future rounds, was that there was access to local Indigenous elders, like at that specific community, because we had access to elders through the university, through the Indigenous Advisory Council, through the traditional knowledge holder, but they weren't necessarily from the community. So I think having someone that's from the community that can act as a guide would be really important for sure, and particularly if it's a new relationship. And because I think that there's just competing tensions and needs as well. Like academic researchers too have high pressure, particularly in bigger institutions, to produce, and it's like there's pressure to publish, there's pressure to get more funding and to do things within a very particular time span that doesn't necessarily, and often doesn't, line up with what community needs are. So having, I think, support and to be able to push back against that, so that you have that space to do good work, is what is also needed. And I think that can be facilitated with, yeah, some kind of mediation, elders, traditional knowledge holders, etc., that understand kind of both both sides in a way, but prioritizing, I would say, because the power balance is still, you know, leaning towards academic institutions and researchers, like that really kind of, you know, shifts the focus a little bit more towards the needs and wants and safety and benefit of the Indigenous community or organization, right?
We have a question in the chat of
Sure.
you could give some examples of the kinds of research projects that were funded
Sure.
and how they look different or similar to what we think of as sort of more typical academic-led research projects.
Yeah, I mean, I think they were pretty similar in many ways. One of the projects was about the use of this traditional plant medicine for lice. So that was a very, you know, like not a clinical trial, but it was really looking at the effectiveness of this particular plant for lice. And they worked with a medical anthropologist. There was also a program that they were trying to develop a culturally based counseling program for Inuit children up north. There was a land-based treatment program that they had developed and they wanted to develop it further. So as research, I mean, I guess some of the research was a little bit evaluative for programming that was either being developed or was wanting to evolve. Because there was also, yeah, this land-based treatment program for people that, Indigenous people that had survived the 60s scoop. So they had created some land-based programming, healing programming, and they wanted to do research on the existing program and, you know, what were the experiences of people, how did it help, how could it be, you know, help more, etc. There was also a program related to food security development, the use of ayahuasca for the treatment of substance use. And there was also a study, again, that was it was with a biologist where it was a land contamination study because this was in a community up north where they have really high rates of this type of cancer that's affecting children that normally does not affect children. And so they were looking at land contamination. And so those are some of the projects that were done. Another was related to, yeah, child welfare policy. So I think they were, you know, some of them were a little more evaluative in nature, program development, but also just like, yeah, research about a particular program or use of a substance for the treatment of something, or, you know, looking at, yeah, the causes of cancer based on, you know, substances that they had found in the land in that region. So,
So,
I mean, I think one of the things like that's important is the projects took a long time because of COVID. So some projects stopped for a while because there was too many competing priorities. They didn't have the capacity because they were prioritizing this, you know, health and safety of their community. So yeah, it was a very strange time, but I think, but you know, when you get down to the projects were very, yeah, similar to other kinds of projects in terms of, you know, the subjects, etc. Like they were very varied. They were really varied, which was interesting. Yeah.
and then I know many of the projects were just finishing or still ongoing when you wrote the paper. Do you have a sense of what's happened with any of the research and sort of how it's morphed into responses in the communities?
I don't have a strong sense of that because like my role finished, and I know that like for one of the projects related to ayahuasca, like out of that came they actually had a conference that was around the use of ayahuasca for substance use, like in because ayahuasca is not local to this region, but you know, so there was, yeah, a conference that brought together community and researchers from across the world, really. So that's something that happened. I know that the land-based treatment program, like they have I don't know the details of the research, but I know that they're continuing to grow their programming, so that's expanding. And yeah, the development of the culturally based counseling for Inuit children, again, that is ongoing, but I think that, you know, their project is completed and they built some counseling, like informed counseling based on the needs of the children in that region. But yeah, I wasn't, because some of the projects, yeah, they took more than a couple of years. And so, I kind of shifted roles, but I am interested. And so I should definitely, maybe get more details on that. But there was also a shift there was a new academic advisor. There was a shift in who the VP was. Like there was just a lot of movement. Indigenous funding stream it's on hold right now. So yeah, like things kind of, partly because of COVID, et cetera, it got kind of, because I think there was actually some expectation that the research would happen quicker. And so I think that, yeah, it didn't for various reasons. And I think that is just the nature of doing research in this way, but also, a pandemic and et cetera were definitely, impediments to moving things along.
Absolutely.
But I know that they all felt like that relationship is something that they are going to like that they're going to do more research together. Like I know that most of the projects there was mutual feelings of like we want to work more together. This was a good experience. We want to do it again. And so in terms of the goal of, building that relationship, it worked quite well. Yeah.
That's wonderful. One of the big takeaways in the paper was about, and you've talked about this a bit, the flow of funding acting counter to the intentions of community identified, led, and owned research. So I'm hoping you can talk a bit about both, to integrate a question from the chat, what compensation for Indigenous knowledge holders and community researchers looks like in this context, and then the structures of the university that made the sort of proper valuing and rewarding of that knowledge somewhat challenging.
Well, I think the first part, maybe I'll get you to re-ask the second part of that question. But the first part, so honorarium, the Elders Council, the traditional knowledge holder, they actually work at the university. So one of them is like he's paid by the university. He's a full-time person at the university. So that was part of his role. The Elders Council get honorarium for they got an honorarium for their involvement, and the researcher, the community or Indigenous organization based research assistants, they got paid according to what the university standards are for research assistants. So yeah, so there was that was handled kind of in not a standard way, but kind of a standard way. Like there's a standard pay set for research assistants or research youth research assistants at the university. And so that's how the community had to bill. They had to invoice the academic researcher, and then the academic researcher had to send it to the university. They had to go through that channel. But so, and yeah, I mean, I've kind of talked about just how, the money, the flow of the money, who controlled the money was very strongly at the academic researcher and university level. Like the community organization didn't have any control over that, other than just sending in invoices and then having to wait to get paid. And sometimes it took a long time. So I think sometimes it's just like 6 weeks. And so there was a lot of that kind of waiting and paperwork and things that were challenges for the community that wanted to pay their youth a little quicker, or so I think that one of the main things we learned from the evaluation of this project was that there needs to be, and I said it earlier, is there needs to be a shift in who controls the funding, either that it's more equal, or the community themselves control the funding. And yeah, that was definitely, we heard that loud and clear from the evaluation of this project, for sure. And yeah, maybe if you wanted to ask if there's things that I'm not answering here with regards to the question. I mean, I think that, some of the deeper structures at the university that can change to really decolonize research. Like it includes seeing people not as participants, but as research partners. And that is like a mind shift, because even our language, like how do you use, like I'm writing this report right now and it's hard not to use the word participant, right? So, changing our language, challenging standardized ways of approaching knowledge sharing or research dissemination, because, some of the communities, they didn't want publications. And so the university wants publications. And the researcher, especially if they're new researchers, they need publications. And so, yeah, kind of opening up. And there are a few shifts happening at some universities, as to what counts. Like if you're going for tenure, for example, like what counts as, valuable, valid research dissemination in that process of going for tenure, like kind of expanding that to, extend beyond, publications in certain journals to be more like community based, like, or arts based, or, knowledge sharing events that are more like a talking circle. And, yeah, just kind of opening up what, and I think in some, that is beginning to happen in some sense. What else? I think, it's really important, and this goes through all of what I've been saying, that, academic researchers need to understand, the social, historical, and political context of the Indigenous people at Turtle Island, but specifically for the specific community that they're working with. And not just from a literature review, like reading about, but to actually have lived experience, like spending some time there. And again, those things are all, they take time, and it's counter to, these structures of productivity that say, we want, you got to get this research done quick. And so, yeah, like, and thinking about what their role is in that relationship, what's their responsibilities, what it, like that, the principle of reciprocity, like what's my research, like building this into the core of your project, like what am I contributing and giving back to this relationship, like how is it benefiting this community, and how can I help facilitate that, are key questions, I think, that we need to ask ourselves, like to be reflexive about those things, right?
So I'll ask one last question and then open it up to the
Okay.
audience. Anyone else has any? So you talked at the beginning about OCAP principles and the idea that the data ownership is really fundamental in research within Indigenous communities. And so if you could talk a little bit about the protection of raw data, the data management aspects that were integrated into these projects, and what that looked like in terms of whether there was sort of existing data management infrastructure and knowledge within the communities, whether that had to be built for these projects, or whether these were more sort of one-offs and there wasn't a lot of focus on how it got integrated into broader knowledge streams within the communities.
Yeah. In terms of data sovereignty, like so there is OCAP principles. There's specifically First Nations, but they're adopted by many different Indigenous communities. But it was really up to the specific community how they wanted to, operationalize data sovereignty, like whether some didn't have capacity to hold and store data. So then it was they negotiated that the academic researcher would hold it. There was, just that was a negotiation. I mean, I wasn't really like we were there. We weren't involved in the research per se. We were involved in the surrounding things around the research to make sure that things were going well. We weren't involved in the research itself. So some of that I don't have the answer to, like in terms of how, things played out, but we definitely, I know that things went well and people were happy because we reached out to all along the way and afterwards too, to ask, like, how are things going, and is there any concerns, or, how can we help if there's any concern, etc. So, but yeah, I think that standardly people are adopting, the OCAP principles, so that that includes even like around knowledge dissemination, like negotiating. It's the community's research, so you need to negotiate with them how that research is used, right, before you do anything with it per se. So Yeah, and I do know, and I think I already said this, maybe I'm repeating myself, but some of the organizations or communities, they didn't have the capacity to store the data. So they trusted it with the researcher. And some of them made like more formal kind of agreements about it, but others it was like more of just a, it was like a verbal contract, right? So yeah, I don't know, but I wasn't in the nitty gritty of that part of things. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, part of that's just my own deep interest
Yeah,
in
no,
data management within
it's a good
community
question.
engaged research, because sometimes it's hard to actually implement those principles.
It is, yeah, and not just because they're there, they were created, it doesn't mean that every community wants that, because it's also a responsibility, and you need capacity to hold and data and be responsible in that way. Like, but I think ultimately the the idea that and the principle that the research is the property of the community or organization was core. How it was stored and how it was used, that was negotiated with between the two groups, like between the academic researcher and the community or organization. Yeah, so they did, there was some, yeah, agreements about, because some communities said, they didn't want, right off the bat, they said, we don't want any publications. Someone, wanted to see, well, what's the research? Yeah, what comes from the research first before we decide like what we're going to do with it. But it was really meant, most of the projects, there was either to develop a program or, but meant to like, benefit the community to develop a project or, something. I mean, I know the land contamination project, like that one, they wanted it to go farther because it was a serious health problem that was being raised, and they did find that there was a high level of a certain chemical in the ground because of old rail lines and where the reserve was. And so some cleanup, actually there was advocacy and there was some cleanup that actually was taking place. But it's not that it was easy to get that to happen, but despite the evidence of its existence of this contamination, but things were set in motion to actually you know try and get rid of to clean the land, like to make it so that that contaminant was moved out. So in that way, it was a very practical, there was some very practical outcomes of that. Important. Yeah.
We have time if there's a question or two from anyone listening.
Yeah, if there's anyone that has any questions too, I mean, I feel people can always email me too if they want. You can give my email, but yeah, no, I think I answered the question about compensation for the knowledge holders, and yeah, I think, like, I know York and U of T has a standard amount that they give, which I think is like $500 or something for.
Yeah, I'm just glancing at the questions we didn't get to. I mean, one that we've talked about a little bit, but the context of COVID and
Mm-hmm.
um, you talk a little bit in the paper about sort of the intentions for in-person and deeply engaged
Yeah.
processes and the switch over to electronic communication. And so I was curious if there are things that you think are really sort of unique and interesting about decolonized community-led research in the context of COVID
Yeah.
versus what else you have done.
Well, I know, I mean, I definitely know that it took, and people said this, it took longer to build relationships and trust in the virtual space because we only met one community person in person. And that was, I mean, I don't know if it was just by chance, but yeah, it was like that was a different kind of like relationship, the way things kind of progressed. But so I would say that moving things online definitely made things go slower in terms of relationship building and of course the research, but yeah, building that trust, it just took longer. So our timelines too got stretched because we actually met, I think it was from between April, like 4 or 5 months, we met very regularly with the community first to try and, because they were like, well, why? Because we got a couple of responses, from our cold calls or emails like, well, why are you asking me this? Like, why are you asking us? Why do you want us to be involved in this? Like, there was some, and for good reason, like because of, histories, etc. But so I think that for the groups that were keen or curious, it took longer. Like, and I think that having the traditional knowledge holder there really helped that, but it took, because he was just adapting to that too. He had never done like an opening ceremony online before, and he's like, "This is very strange. We have to pretend we're in a circle." Like, so those things were challenging. And then the researcher and the community never met in person. So that it also that slowed things down, not just because of competing priorities, but also because the researcher couldn't go into the community to do any, if they needed to help do data collection or anything like that, they couldn't go into the community. So, that, yeah, made things more challenging too. And yeah, it just wasn't a priority really. So, like, the research became backseat to what was going on because there was so much fear and everything. Like, people wasn't sure, how is this pandemic going to affect Indigenous peoples, because it was very clear that for some, like, it could affect people in any way. It was very random too, but COVID also, we knew that people that were more had pre-existing health issues or vulnerabilities, marginalized populations could be more affected by it. So yeah, I think that but at the same time, I would say, and I think this has continued on in many different spaces, like, being able to have meetings with people from across Canada, at any point, like not having to go there, not like just being able to jump on a call, like that also kind of made things easier in other ways. Once that trust is built, right? It made things easier to just, meet online. But I think, most people really want to meet in person too. But, and maybe, I mean, I'm just hypothesizing here, but I think that, the fact that the researcher couldn't visit perhaps also enabled the community to be a little bit more in charge in that way because the researcher wasn't there, right? So, and we had good, I'm not saying, I'm not making any judgment about the researchers. They were all very good. I just know from what they said, it was very hard not to take the lead because that's what they're trained to do. And also, how do you stay engaged but you're not lead? Like, how do you negotiate that? One of the things we did learn, because I know we're out of time, is just that, maybe having more clearly defined, like, our workshops about what those roles are, learning about how to do this kind of work in this way, what the roles are a little more clearly. But I mean, we were also learning as we went along, but I think that was also some of the feedback we got, was that it would be nice to have, like, learn from each other, learn from some of the other academic researchers, what were they experiencing, and have workshops or have more kind of clearly outlined or on paper, because we were doing things more online in the moment, or problems arose. It was so, yeah, anyway.
Yeah. Thank you so much. I
Oh,
know
you're
a number
welcome.
of people have had to leave, but we really appreciate this.
Yeah,
And
thanks for
thank you all
inviting me.
for
It was
joining.
fun. Yeah, it was great. Nice to meet you.